You know what happens when you stop chasing someone who's emotionally unavailable? They notice. Not because they suddenly miss you, not necessarily because they've realized how incredible you are, but because the rhythm has changed. Avoidants thrive on distance. They feel safest when someone wants them just a bit more than they're willing to give. It keeps them in control. But when you stop chasing, when you stop reaching, stop trying, stop over-explaining your worth, you introduce something they never expected, uncertainty, and that makes them uncomfortable. They may circle back. Not out of growth, but out of ego. They'll check to see if you've moved on. They'll text at midnight. They'll comment on a story, ask how you've been, just enough to reopen the door, not enough to walk through it. But here's the part no one tells you. When you stop chasing, you're not just doing something to them. You're doing something for you. You're saying, I don't negotiate my value. You're saying love isn't meant to feel like pursuit. It's meant to feel like peace. Avoidance may flinch when you remove your energy, but that's not your cue to return. That's your sign that your silence speaks volumes. And if they ever want to truly connect, it has to be without fear, without games, and without making you responsible for their comfort. Because when someone is right for you, you won't need to chase. You'll just meet them in the middle. When you stop chasing someone who leans avoidant, the first thing they feel, often subconsciously, is the sudden absence of pressure. It's as if the air around them becomes lighter, quieter, unfamiliar. For someone with avoidant tendencies, intimacy feels like a threat and pursuit feels like a trap. They often equate closeness with a loss of independence or identity. So when someone chases them, calling, texting, trying to connect, they instinctively pull back. They aren't necessarily trying to hurt anyone. Their nervous system simply registers closeness as danger. But what happens when you remove yourself from that chase? When you take a breath, pull your energy back, and stop trying to earn closeness? They notice. Not always immediately, and not always in a dramatic or obvious way. But the shift in dynamic doesn't go unnoticed. Before, they were operating in a dynamic where they were the one being pursued, where you were doing the emotional heavy lifting. Now there's a space, a gap, and human nature hates a vacuum. Avoidants often don't process emotions in real time. They tend to suppress, avoid, rationalize, intellectualize. But when you're no longer available, your absence begins to echo. Not necessarily because they've realized how much they care, at least not yet, but because something that used to be predictable is now missing. The pattern they were used to has broken. You were the constant reaching out, checking in, holding space. And now that energy is gone, it can be incredibly disorienting for them. The chase, though uncomfortable, served a function. It allowed them to feel desirable without the risk of vulnerability. They could keep you at arm's length while still absorbing your attention, still benefiting from the emotional nourishment without having to reciprocate it deeply. When you stop giving that, they start to feel the shift in power. You are no longer signaling, I'll do whatever it takes to be close to you. Instead, you're signaling, I'm no longer willing to carry this dynamic alone. This is where their discomfort begins. They may not label it as such, but they'll feel a subtle anxiety, a dissonance that might come in the form of vague curiosity. I wonder why she hasn't texted. Or irritation. Who does he think he is? Disappearing like that? Or even confusion. I thought they were really into me. What happened? And even though they may have pulled away initially, your disengagement puts them in unfamiliar territory. They've lost their emotional upper hand. What's crucial to understand is that avoidants often operate on delayed emotional timelines. They might not feel your absence right away because they're skilled at shutting down and compartmentalizing. But as time passes, something shifts. The relief they initially felt when you stopped chasing turns into something else. Sometimes it's boredom. Sometimes it's loneliness. And sometimes it's the creeping realization that they don't feel quite as in control as they thought. And that's when they often circle back, not necessarily because they're ready to show up differently, but because they're trying to restore the dynamic they were comfortable with. They might send a casual message. They might accidentally, like an old post. They might check your story without saying a word. These are not random acts. They are quiet bids to see if the door is still open, to test whether your attention is still available without having to ask directly. That way, they can feel close again, on their terms, without fully stepping into vulnerability. It's important to recognize that this reaction doesn't always indicate emotional growth. It indicates disruption. They're responding to a change in the script, and most people, avoidant or not, don't like when the script changes unexpectedly, especially if they were benefiting from the original version. That discomfort is not the same as realization or readiness, but it is a sign that your energy mattered, that your presence was felt more than they ever admitted out loud. They may not say, "I miss how hard you tried for me," but they will feel the absence of the effort they never had to reciprocate. They may not admit, "I depended on your emotional investment more than I let on," but your silence brings them face to face with the emotional gap they were avoiding all along. Here's the twist: the moment you stop chasing, you become unpredictable. And for someone who was used to you orbiting around them, that's a jolt. Now they're the one wondering, they're the one feeling unsure. And this subtle reversal unsettles their nervous system more than they expect, because as much as avoidants fear closeness, they also fear losing a sense of security, even if that security came from a dynamic that wasn't entirely fair. And yet, that fear is not necessarily enough to make them change. Some may lean in and try to connect for real. Others may simply poke at you enough to see if you'll go back to the old role. That's why it's so important not to misread their reaction as proof that you should re-enter the chase. What you're seeing is not clarity. It's curiosity, control, ego, or even panic. But it's not necessarily emotional availability. So when you stop chasing an avoidant, they do notice. The silence isn't lost on them. Your absence isn't invisible. It registers, not always with language, but with sensation, with that uneasy feeling that something just shifted and they're no longer the center of someone's emotional world. And for someone who relied on your energy to feel wanted, that change is more powerful than any words you could ever say. When someone with avoidant tendencies starts to notice your absence, it can trigger a kind of subtle panic. But it's important to understand that the response you often get from them isn't rooted in deep reflection or personal growth. It's not about them suddenly recognizing that they mishandled the relationship or mistreated your emotional effort. More often, it's about ego. It's about a disruption in their control over the dynamic and their instinctive need to regain it. Avoidants are not necessarily cold-hearted people. They're often deeply sensitive, but that sensitivity is wrapped in layers of self-protection. Intimacy to them feels risky. It brings up old wounds, fear of engulfment, fear of losing autonomy, fear of being hurt if they let someone truly see them. So they stay at a distance, especially when they sense someone is emotionally available or getting too close. They pull away, they create space, they minimize emotional conversations, and in response, many people try harder to connect. They chase, they explain, they wait patiently, hoping the avoidant will come around. But when you finally stop chasing, when you withdraw your energy and give them the space they seem to want, they often don't feel relief for long. Initially, there may be a sense of ease on their end. They feel safe again. No one's pressuring them. No one's asking for more than they want to give. But what follows that brief calm is often an unexpected itch, a discomfort, a curiosity, a low-grade sense that something's missing. That's when they start to return, not with a full heart, not with accountability, but with crumbs. They reappear in ways that are non-committal, a vague, "Hey, how have you been?" message, a reaction to your Instagram story, a song shared that reminds them of something you once talked about. They're small actions, but they're deliberate. They're testing the waters to see if they still have emotional access to you. If you respond, they've confirmed it, they're still wanted, they're still desirable, they still matter to you. That gives them reassurance, not about you, but about themselves. You might find yourself thinking, "They must miss me. Why else would they come back?" But this is where discernment is crucial. Missing someone isn't the same as being ready to show up for them. There's a difference between longing and loving. An avoidant may reach out because their sense of control has been threatened, not because they've had a profound realization about how they hurt you or how much effort you were putting in. Their actions are usually more about ego maintenance than genuine reconnection. It's a hard truth to swallow, especially when you've been waiting for them to reach out. But their return doesn't always mean what you want it to mean. Sometimes it's just about checking if they still have you, if they can still activate you emotionally, if you'll still respond when they drop breadcrumbs, It's not about building something new. It's about proving they haven't lost their grip. This dynamic can be especially confusing because the avoidant often won't come back with obvious red flags. They may even seem sweet, reflective, or slightly more vulnerable than before. But look closely. Are they apologizing? Are they taking ownership? Are they expressing a desire to rebuild with mutual effort? Or are they just resurfacing with casual conversation, hinting at connection without ever explicitly offering it? What tends to happen is they offer just enough to stir your feelings again, but not enough to create stability. They might flirt, reminisce, suggest a meetup, or express vague interest. But when it comes time to define anything or take consistent steps forward, they freeze. Because nothing inside them has fundamentally changed. They're still protecting themselves. They're still afraid of real closeness. They're still not ready to meet you at the level you were offering before. The reason this kind of re-engagement is so effective is because it plays on your hope. You want to believe they've had a change of heart, that your silence made them reflect, that they're coming back because they see your value now. And sometimes they'll even say things that sound like that. But unless their actions align with emotional availability, all you're getting is the illusion of progress. They're not walking back into your life with open hands. They're reaching out to see if the door is still cracked. If you let them in at that stage, what often follows is a repeat of the old cycle. The push-pull dynamic reignites. They feel reassured by your attention, and once they have it again, the urgency that brought them back begins to fade. They retreat once more, leaving you confused and hurt, wondering why they reached out at all. This emotional yo-yoing isn't a sign of care. It's a symptom of their fear and their unresolved inner conflict. The painful part is that during these moments, you might still be hoping for something deeper, but while you were doing the work, processing your feelings, trying to move forward, building emotional clarity, they were simply adjusting to your absence. That adjustment isn't the same as growth. It's just them realizing that something felt different and their ego wanted reassurance. So when an avoidant returns after you stop chasing, it's often about reestablishing their sense of control, not repairing the relationship. The reappearance is less about love and more about testing whether the old dynamic still works. Whether you're still there, whether they still have an emotional impact on you. It's not evil or manipulative in a calculated sense. It's unconscious, but it's still damaging if you interpret it as something more meaningful than it actually is. That's why it's so important to respond with clarity instead of longing. You have to look beyond the words, beyond the nostalgia, and beyond the desire to be chosen. Their return might feel validating, but it isn't always a healthy invitation. More often, it's a mirror reflecting how far you've come and how much further you want to go without falling back into old emotional traps. When you stop chasing someone, especially someone with avoidant tendencies, it can feel like you're doing something drastic, almost like giving up. But the truth is it's not giving up. It's stepping back into your own power. It's no longer about what they're doing or not doing. It's about what you are finally choosing to stop tolerating. Stopping the chase is not an act of spite or manipulation. It's an act of emotional self-respect. It's saying, I'm no longer willing to keep pouring into a space that isn't pouring back into me. When you're in a dynamic with someone avoidant, you often find yourself in a position where you're constantly making the effort. You initiate conversations. You hold space for their moods. You try to decode their mixed signals. You excuse their inconsistencies because you understand that they're scared or emotionally guarded. You tell yourself, if I'm just a little more patient, they'll come around. But with every unanswered text, every moment of emotional unavailability, you begin to feel smaller, less seen, less valued. And yet you keep showing up, hoping that consistency will earn you connection, that if you love them just right, they'll finally feel safe enough to love you back. But real love doesn't require that kind of sacrifice. Not the sacrifice of your self-worth, not the constant ignoring of your own needs, not the minimizing of your emotional reality just to make someone else feel more comfortable. That's not love. That's self-abandonment. And the moment you stop chasing is the moment you stop abandoning yourself. It's the moment you say, I deserve more than this breadcrumb communication. I deserve more than guessing games. I deserve someone who chooses me without hesitation. Avoidants don't always realize how much they've been shielded by your effort. Your pursuit gave them space to stay distant. You filled in the emotional gaps. You made excuses, bridged silences, and tolerated ambiguity. In a way, your chasing gave them permission not to show up fully. But when you pull back, you disrupt that dynamic. You remove the emotional scaffolding they've relied on. And what's left is silence, a silence they now have to sit with. For the first time, they're left alone with the consequences of their emotional detachment. But the focus here isn't them. The real transformation happens in you. Because when you stop chasing, you stop trying to negotiate your value. You stop asking, why won't they choose me? And start asking, why was I trying so hard to be chosen? That shift is everything. It changes the way you carry yourself. It changes the way you see relationships. You begin to realize that your worth doesn't increase based on how much effort you put in, especially not when that effort is one-sided. It can feel strange at first. You may experience withdrawal, like you're missing something. And in a way, you're missing the version of yourself that needed to earn love. You're missing the high of momentary validation when they did respond. You're missing the hope you used to cling to when they gave you just enough to stay. But what you're gaining is far more valuable. You're gaining your peace, your clarity, your ability to hear your own voice again. Stepping back isn't about punishing them. It's not about playing games. It's about drawing a line that says, this is what I will and won't accept. And that's not a tactic. That's a standard. It's a declaration of your emotional boundaries. You're not trying to get them to chase you now. You're simply choosing not to be in a dynamic where you're always chasing someone who's emotionally unavailable. It's easy to confuse stepping back with being cold or indifferent. But it's the opposite. It's deeply self-compassionate. It means you're finally turning inward and saying, how do I feel in this situation? Am I being met here? Or am I just constantly giving, hoping that one day I'll receive something back? The more you ask yourself those questions, the clearer it becomes that the relationship wasn't balanced. Not because you weren't enough, but because it was never built on mutual emotional investment. Avoidants often don't offer that kind of investment, not because they're bad people, but because they're wired to protect themselves from closeness. And while you may empathize with that, you also have to ask where does my empathy for them become neglect for myself? When does understanding their behavior turn into excusing it to the point where I'm completely disregarding my needs? When you stop chasing, you start taking care of your emotional self. You begin to create space for people who don't need to be pursued to show up. People who are already available. People who meet you halfway without needing to be pulled forward. And the longer you stay in that space, out of the chase, out of the emotional tug of war, the more grounded you feel. You stop waking up anxious about whether they'll text you. You stop reading messages to find hidden meanings. You stop hoping that this time they'll be different. You start breathing again. There's power in that. Quiet, steady, transformative power. Because you're no longer trying to prove your worth to someone who couldn't see it. You're no longer twisting yourself into shapes to be enough for someone whose eyes were always half closed. You're standing in the full light of who you are and saying, this is me. I'm done shrinking. And that decision, even if it hurts at first, becomes your turning point, not just in this one relationship, but in how you approach all connections moving forward. You realize you don't want to be in anything that feels like chasing again. You want to be met, seen, held. And most importantly, you want to be in relationships where your value is never a question, because you've already answered it for yourself. When you stop chasing someone, especially someone who's used to your consistent emotional effort, your silence begins to speak for you. You don't need to send long messages explaining why you've pulled back. You don't need to justify your decision or craft the perfect exit. Your quiet withdrawal does something more powerful. It forces reflection without words. It shifts the dynamic in a way that no emotional argument ever could, because silence can't be argued with. It can't be debated or dismissed. It just is. Someone who's avoidant is often skilled at detachment. They know how to distance themselves from their own emotions and from yours. When you were constantly reaching out, showing care, asking questions, initiating connection, they had the luxury of being unbothered. They could maintain emotional distance without truly feeling the consequences of it. But once that energy is gone, the echo left behind is louder than any words you ever said while you were trying to be heard. Your silence becomes a mirror. It reflects the space they created. It shows them, without blame or confrontation, Exactly what it feels like to be met with emotional distance. And because it's not aggressive, it's not something they can deflect. They can't accuse you of drama. They can't say you're overreacting. All they're left with is the absence, and absence has a way of getting under the skin in ways that presence never can. For the first time, they are forced to ask themselves questions they never had to consider before. Why aren't you reaching out? Have you moved on? Do you still care? What changed? These questions don't always come from a place of love or clarity. They often come from discomfort, from the sudden lack of control over your attention. And that discomfort grows not because you're punishing them, but because you're no longer feeding a system where they benefit from your emotional labor without contributing much in return. Avoidants often thrive in dynamics where the other person is more emotionally invested. It gives them room to stay distant without ever feeling abandoned. But when you go quiet, when you stop chasing, you take away the part of the equation that made their detachment so easy. Suddenly, there's no one holding up the bridge, and they start to feel that collapse. They may not admit it. They may even pretend they're unaffected. But silence has a way of creating tension that words often fail to deliver. It makes people confront things they've avoided. It makes them feel what they've numbed. They may try to test your silence. You might get a message out of nowhere. A casual, hope you're good. Something non-committal, just enough to see if they still have access to you. Because if they can draw a response, even a small one, it means your silence was only temporary. It means the door is still open. And that's what many avoidants want, the door open, just in case, but not so open that they have to step fully inside. But if you hold the line and continue to be still, their sense of security is shaken. That's when silence becomes more than a message. It becomes a boundary. And boundaries don't require raised voices or long speeches. The most powerful boundary is often the one communicated through calm detachment, through the absence of repeated explanations, through the refusal to re-enter a dynamic that drains you. That kind of silence says, I've seen enough. It says, I'm no longer auditioning for your affection. It tells them that you're no longer a guaranteed source of validation, and that truth carries weight. What makes silence so powerful is that it shifts the responsibility. You're no longer the one trying to solve, to fix, to pursue clarity. You've stepped out of the emotional tug of war. And now if they want something, they have to initiate, they have to be clear, they have to decide whether they're willing to come forward in a real way. But many won't. Because for some, the comfort of distance is still more appealing than the effort of intimacy. And that's a truth they have to face alone, without your energy softening the impact. Meanwhile, you begin to feel the power of your own restraint. You realize you didn't need to prove your point with another conversation. You didn't need them to validate your hurt. Your silence allowed you to reclaim your energy without having to explain your worth. And that's the beauty of it. The person who was once in control of the emotional pace now feels the imbalance. They sense that something's